My name is Alice Paul.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming.
It's nice to be here.
How did your parents and your upbringing influence and impact your involvement as a suffragist?
Well, certainly my Quaker heritage played a great influence in my becoming involved in women's suffrage. I was raised on a lovely farm in New Jersey, and my parents were Hicksite Quakers. And so I attended a Quaker school in a nearby town. As Quakers, my parents had an abiding regard for things such as peace and social justice, and they raised their 4 children, I was the eldest, to believe deeply in the idea of equality, and that included gender equality. My mother actually attended college, which was quite uncommon in her day. She dropped out after 3 years in order to marry my father, and married women weren't welcome in college in those days, so that was it for her, but she was a suffragist. And so as a little girl, she took me with her to meetings and rallies, and so I was exposed to suffrage from early on.
What events in your life moved you toward working for women's rights?
Well, I'd have to say the thing that had the most impact was in 1905, after I had graduated from Swarthmore. I was very interested in the field of social work, and I had the opportunity to spend a year working with poor immigrant families in a settlement house on the Lower East Side of New York City. And I witnessed the deplorable conditions in the tenements. It was heartbreaking. Most of the apartments didn't have running water. There were no showers, no toilets. Very few had electricity installed at that point. But the women had to haul buckets of water from spigots in the backyard all the way up 4, 5, 6 flights of stairs in order to do their cooking and their cleaning and their laundry. It was back-breaking work. And I just felt that they were trapped in poverty. They were bearing children, raising children, bearing children, raising children, and they were totally dependent on the income of their husbands. And a few of the husbands had a habit of stopping at the corner saloon on payday, and so children went hungry. It was difficult. Some of the women were able to work in sweatshops, or the single women that didn't have children to care for would get jobs in mills or factories, but for long, long hours, very little pay, and often in unsafe working conditions. It just seemed to me that social work wasn't making much of a difference in the lives of those women. And that's when I realized that I wanted to work for women's rights, and especially for what I believed would give women some power, and that was, of course, winning the vote.
Now, you spent several years studying in England with other women suffragists.
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn from them, and how did they impact your strategies in the U.S.?
Yes, in 1907, I was able to go to England to study at a Quaker school. It was named Woodbrook. And I became involved in the suffrage movement there with Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst, a mother and daughter, who led a suffrage group called the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. And they had us doing things like handing out suffrage literature, giving little speeches on street corners, heckling politicians in order to get attention for suffrage. We joined in their rallies and their suffrage marches. It was all very exciting. And I learned a great deal from working with the Pankhursts. One of the things that I always remember is Emmeline had a motto, and her motto was that it's deeds, not words, that matter.
In England, how did you use tactics of civil disobedience to get the suffragist message to the public? Can you describe some of the physical dangers you experienced during your protests?
Oh, yes. Well, the Women's Social and Political Union was a militant suffrage group, and occasionally they did engage in some destructive actions like throwing rocks through windows, cutting telegraph wires, and sometimes setting small fires on golf courses. The men hated that. And yes, we did get arrested there. I was arrested with the Pankhursts a few times. We were kicked and shoved and beat with billy clubs and thrown in jail. And it was there that I had my first experience with going on a hunger strike. The Pankhursts, that was there. And hunger strikes were considered a kind of passive resistance. But yes, we went on hunger strikes, and sometimes we were force-fed. They put tubes down our throats, and they forced us to drink this horrid concoction. It was a mixture of raw eggs and milk. And it was extremely unpleasant, and some women got violently ill. I still have some medical issues that stem from that tube feeding. I just wanted to mention one thing. At this time when I was with the Pankhursts, that was when I met Lucy Burns. She was also there. And we went on to work together back in the United States on suffrage for many, many years.
What type of resistance did you face from society?
Well, there was certainly that. There was resistance. Back in our country, there was a deep hostility from the liquor lobby, for one thing. They were threatened, with the idea of prohibition. I suppose they just assumed that once women got the vote, we would just go right out there and outlaw the sale of alcohol. Ironically, the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, which did just that, was actually passed over a year before women got the vote. There were women who opposed suffrage altogether. Now, of course, most of them were well off and wanted for nothing, and so they felt that they didn't need the vote. But they formed organizations which were like the Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And they went to Congress and they lobbied against suffrage. And that was sort of competing with our efforts for suffrage.
Now, what differences caused you to split with the NAWSA and form the CU and then later the National Woman's Party?
There's a lot there. We all had the same goal, universal suffrage. The National American group had always concentrated their efforts on a state-by-state campaign. And I certainly supported that, but I also felt that we should be putting some of our time and energy and money to demanding a constitutional amendment for suffrage. The women continued to endorse President Wilson and the Democrats. I thought that we should be holding them responsible for women not having the vote because they were the party in power. Well, the National American leaders disagreed with me. They didn't want to ruffle any feathers. I didn't really care if I ruffled any feathers because I believe that unless women are prepared to fight politically, then they must be content to be ignored politically, you see. So eventually the National American leaders started to come around a little bit to seeing things my way. And they put me in charge of a congressional committee. And so I was able to set up a little office. Lucy Burns and I set up an office in Washington, and our job was to lobby Congress. But we were told that we had to raise our own money. So we worked really hard to do some fundraising. We did some creative things. And one of the earliest things that we did was we organized a suffrage parade. In March of 1913, we had a grand parade. Over 5,000 suffragists and supporters, and even some women from the National American, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. with banners and floats and women on horseback. It was quite a spectacle. And there were huge crowds of onlookers on either side of the street. Unfortunately, there were some men that got a little nasty, and they started to taunt the women and throw things and trip them. And they started to crowd in so that we couldn't move forward, and pushing and shoving ensued, and pretty soon there was some physical violence. Meanwhile, the police stood and watched. They did nothing. But someone had the good sense to call the cavalry, and they came and restored order. Now, the next day, the suffrage parade had made national headlines. And after that, suffrage became a popular topic of conversation everywhere. It was all the rage. Everyone was talking about suffrage. So despite the pandemonium, I considered the parade a great success.
Good.
Now, there was the issues between the National American and our congressional committee. We disagreed in a lot of things. And Lucy and I felt like the movement was just languishing. And we thought it was time for some bold tactics. So we created a new autonomous group called the Congressional Union, the CU. So we went from the CC to the CU. We even published our own newspaper, The Suffragist, which we sold at a profit. But unfortunately, by 1914, the rift between the two groups had just gotten too wide, and we were forced to sever our ties with the National American group. And in 1916, we decided to form the National Women's Party. And the reason for that was we wanted the government to look at suffrage in a different way, more like a political party, hence the name National Women's Party.
So you and over 1,000 silent sentinels began nearly 2 years of picketing the White House. What was this like? How did the public respond to that?
Well, I'll give you a little background of how we got started with that. In early January of 1917, we had another disappointing meeting with President Wilson, and the National Women's Party group went across the street to their headquarters, which we had recently strategically located across the street from the headquarters, by the way. And it just so happened that Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, happened to be at the meeting. She had come from New York City to be part of the meeting with the National American group, and we invited her to come join our conversation at our headquarters, and she did. So we were talking about, what are some new ways that we can persuade President Wilson to support a suffrage amendment? And it was Harriet that came up with the idea of picketing the White House. I think her mother would have been really pleased with her. And so within a few days, we had trained some silent sentinels, and they were ready to go. By January 10th, they took their places at the gates of the White House, and they held up a banner the very first day to honor our friend Inez. The banner read, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And of course, those were the last words of our friend Inez Milholland, who passed the year before. But after that, women picketed 6 days a week. And regardless of the weather, I mean, we had some nasty weather in January, and it was cold out there, but they were there, dedicated, they picketed. Well, we had some people that were wholeheartedly supportive of what we were doing. They even came and brought us hot drinks in the winter, and some men brought us hot bricks to stand on to keep our feet warm. And then there were other people who just came by and hurled insults and rotten fruit. I wanted to mention, I have this sash on, and the silent sentinels all wore a sash very similar to this, with the purple, white, and gold colors, which were the colors of the National Women's Party. After the country had entered the war over in Europe, we continued to picket. And there were people who felt that our protests were unpatriotic. They called us traitors. They threatened us with bodily harm. And a number of us were even knocked down and had our banners taken from us and destroyed. But I just have to say, the reason that we kept picketing was to honor the mothers of all the young men who they sent over there to fight a war for democracy, while back home, the women did not have the right to vote.
Now, during the picketing, you and others were arrested by the police on pretty flimsy charges of obstructing traffic. What were the conditions like in prison?
Well, this is a couple of parts to this question too. So they trumped up some charges. They charged us with blocking traffic, but we were on the sidewalk. They charged us sometimes with unlawful assemblage. So yes, we were arrested, and at first we were just arrested and given a warning and released. But as the picketing continued, well, then we were given fines. But we refused to pay those fines because we hadn't done anything wrong, you see. And then the court started to give us short prison sentences, and the picketing continued. I have to say, over the summer, many of us were arrested multiple times, not just once. And there were groups of women now getting arrested, so they started to take them down to Virginia to a place called the Occoquan Workhouse. It was a horrid place. They were treated terribly there. When they got there, they took away all of their personal belongings, even their toothbrushes. They took away their clothes, and they gave them these scratchy, dirty prison clothes to wear and shoes that didn't fit. And they fed them food that was just distasteful. It was sour and wormy. But they did okay, and our pickets continued. And then in October of that year, I was arrested for the third time. And I think that they were just trying to get me out of the way, because they gave me a 7-month prison sentence. But I was sentenced to the district jail. And a few weeks later, there was a large group of sentinels led by Lucy Burns and Dora Lewis, and they were arrested protesting my imprisonment. 33 sentinels got hauled down to Occoquan Workhouse, and they were just treated brutally. They were thrown in dirty, rat-infested cells, and they were beaten brutally by guards. And one woman knocked her head and had a concussion. They put Lucy's hands above her head and cuffed her hands to the prison bars, and she had to sit like that for hours. It was just horrid, the way they treated them.
While you were in prison, you organized a hunger strike. Did any of the other women go on to a hunger strike, and what was that experience like?
Well, I was actually in the district jail, and yes, I did go on a hunger strike to protest. When they realized I wasn't going to eat, they tried different things. They tried to deprive me of sleep. They would come in at night and flash lights in my eyes and make noises and try to keep me from sleeping. And then they threatened me with committing me to an insane asylum. And then when I still didn't eat, that was when they strapped me down and put the tubes down my throat and started with the tube feeding, which I was familiar with. And that went on for 2 weeks, 3 times a day. Now, the women at Occoquan, led by Lucy Burns, also did some hunger strikes, and a few of them were also tube-fed, force-fed. Eventually, though, the stories of what was going on leaked out to the newspapers, and there was public outrage, and the administration was embarrassed, of course, and so President Wilson had to look into the situation, and all of us were released by the end of November. It was the hunger strikes, I think, that attracted the public sympathy for our cause, for suffrage.
Now, after your release from prison, did you continue your involvement with the suffragists? And if you did, how did you do that?
Oh, indeed, we did. Yes, there was still so much work to do. The National American continued their work on ratification in the states, and we organized a drive to urge all citizens who already had the vote. You know, there were a lot of women in the western states who their states had already given them the vote, so they were able to vote, and so we urged them to vote against all of the anti-suffrage senators who were coming up for re-election in the fall of 1918. So you see, we were doing some political strategizing there.
How did your activism affect your personal relationships?
Oh, well, you know, some people told me that I was too serious, and I heard people say that they thought I worked too hard and that I expected too much from the people that worked with me. But I did make many acquaintances in the organizations that I belonged to, and I had a few good friends. Lucy Burns and Mabel Vernon were longtime friends. But you see, there was so much work to do, and there was no time for socializing. My primary focus had to be on winning the vote for women.
Now, how did you feel when the 19th Amendment was finally approved in 1920?
Well, of course, I was extremely gratified and quite exhausted. I did have one little sadness, though. I just wished that Inez Milholland could have been there with us as we toasted the 19th Amendment that day.
Now, besides helping to secure the passage of the 19th Amendment, what have you done to promote women's rights?
I authored the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. That was also known as the Lucretia Mott Amendment. And I worked for many, many years to get that passed, and it did finally pass in 1972, but unfortunately it still hasn't been ratified. A good thing is we were able to get an equal rights affirmation included in the preamble to the United Nations Charter. That was exciting.
If people have to remember one thing about you with all of these wonderful accomplishments, what should they remember?
I do hope that people remember all of the dedicated and courageous women over the course of our 72-year struggle for suffrage who worked tirelessly and never gave up and never lost hope. I say, let the people remember that we persisted.